Okay, so in terms of our business items, started to grade the tests this morning. I think I got through 6 of them, 6 or 7 of them. And I'll continue doing that tomorrow and Friday. Hopefully by Friday I'll have it all done, but if not by then, certainly they'll be done by next Monday. Test number 4, that's going to be on Monday, December 16th. We're going to start at 5 p.m. That'll be our start time. If you can't show up at 5 p.m., no harm, no foul. You just show up at 5:30. We start.
Is that the final? Or is that?
That is our final.
Okay.
So that'll be our last day together as a group, sadly, for me at least. And probably for you, you'll be ecstatic to get rid of me, but I'll certainly miss all of you guys. Anyways, so we will start a little earlier than normal, and that's to allow you the opportunity to get out of here earlier that particular night. Let's see here, what else? Oh yeah, the Framingham homework assignment. This is going to be due next Wednesday night. Yeah, the Framingham study. I'm going to put as, if not the most important epidemiological study of the last 70 years, it's certainly one of the most important. So let me just tell you a little bit about the Framingham study. During the 1950s and the 1960s, well, let me just say from the 1950s on up to today, and prior to that, the most common reason for death was cardiovascular in nature. Heart attacks, strokes, those were the major causes of death. And so in 1948 or so, they began the Framingham study. And you might wonder, why does it have the name Framingham? And the answer to that is that it was an epidemiological study that was focused on the citizens of a city in Boston, the name of that city being Framingham. And what they did is they took a look at the health records of these individuals. This is a longitudinal study, which means that they follow these people over time. And the goal was to try to identify what were the risk factors for the development of heart disease. So just recall what I said a few moments ago. Cardiovascular disease is the #1 killer. It still is. So the United States government, NIH, was very interested in what types of things were responsible for the development of heart disease. So they began to follow these individuals. And what they quickly identified is that there are 3 primary risk factors for the development of heart disease. I'm hoping that if I see all of you on the street 70 years from now, and you guys are 90 years old, living nice, long, healthy lives, that you sit there and say, hey, Dr. Coyosa, I remember you talking about the 3 primary risk factors for the development of heart disease. And we're really fortunate, Dr. Coyosa, because we don't have to worry about those 3 risk factors anymore. But that's 70 years from now. That's not today. So what are the 3 primary risk factors for the development of heart disease? Number 1, and these are all equally weighted: smoking, hypertension, hyperlipidemia, or I'll say it differently, hypercholesterolemia. Those are the 3 primary risk factors for the development of cardiovascular disease. And when you folks go out there into the healthcare field within your own families, if you have individuals who develop coronary artery disease, chances are they're a smoker or they have hypertension or they have hypercholesterolemia, or even worse, a combination of all three of those. And so over the course of years, there's been a systematic program in place to try to reduce the number of individuals who smoke, to try to reduce the number of individuals who suffer from hypertension, and to reduce the number of individuals who suffer from hypercholesterolemia. The one thing I can tell you is that related to high levels of cholesterol is that there's these phenomenal classes of drugs out there these days, one of which are called statins. So Lipitor is a very famous statin that will knock the living poop out of your cholesterol levels. It will really bring them down quite a bit. And I'm speaking from experience. When I was your age, my cholesterol levels were typically 130, which is very low. That's where you want to be. But as I got older, as I crept up towards the age of 40, my cholesterol levels kept creeping up until I got up around 200 or so. The average in the United States for folks your age is right around about 220 to 240. So for me, I figured, geez, I'm kind of bulletproof because I'm at 130. But as I said, as I got older, slowly crept up. And that'll be true for many of you in here as well, is that your cholesterol levels will go up. And eventually, you're going to have a primary care physician. You may have a physician assistant, much like yourselves. For some of you at least, they'll sit there and say, you know what, your cholesterol level is too high. We need to get that down. And you can try various nutritional ways to try to bring that down. You can try exercise to bring it down. All those can help mitigate, but eventually you'll find out that those really won't be very effective at all. And so now you're basically left with taking some type of a drug. And as I mentioned, one of them is Lipitor. And you'll be shocked at what Lipitor will do to your cholesterol levels. It'll take you from 240 back down to 130. I think my latest cholesterol was like 105, which is again very, very low. And everybody I talked to who's been on a statin will tell you the same story. So look what's happened to the incidence of heart disease since about 1970 or so. And you can see that in 1970, the number of individuals who are expected to die from cardiovascular disease was about 1.7 million. That's a lot of folks. And now, we don't have the latest data, but you can see now that that's been reduced to about 360,000 or so individuals. That's phenomenal medicine. That's fantastic medicine. Just imagine if we had that for some serious types of cancers, like malignant melanomas, for instance. Malignant melanoma, you got stage 4. It's time to go see your maker and go pray a lot, because it's not going to be a good outcome for you. Anyways, the Framingham study is a phenomenal study. It shows how effective science can be. And so your mantra tomorrow, your mantra this weekend, your mantra during Thanksgiving, your mantra during Christmas, your mantra 10 years from now, 20 years from now, 30 years from now, is that there are 3 primary risk factors for the development of heart disease: smoking, hypertension, hypercholesterolemia. Let me tell you, a secondary risk factor starts with a D, ends with a S. What is it? Diabetes. Let me give you another secondary risk factor: physical inactivity. So if you are physically active, if you're non-diabetic, if you have basically normal blood pressure, normal cholesterol levels, and you don't smoke, man, you've optimized your chances for having a very good health. I didn't say you're going to prevent these things from happening, but the goal is to optimize, and what I mean by that really is to minimize your risk for developing heart disease. And as I've said to you before, I suspect that in many instances your family knows that you're interested in going into the healthcare field. They're going to come to you and sit there and go, geez, Jocelyn, you know, my blood pressure is really elevated. Should I be concerned about that? And you're gonna sit there and go, yeah, Mom, you need to really get that down a lot. My mother-in-law just recently, she's 88 years old, really with it, really very, very healthy. But her blood pressure level just this last week was about 200, which is very, very high. For women, you want them somewhere in the 110s, 120s. So 200 is very, very high. So you're gonna read this article, and then you're gonna make some graphs, and I will send out instructions on the graphs. And what you're gonna do is you're gonna go to, I'll send you a URL that will take you to a cardiovascular risk calculator. And you're gonna calculate the risk for individuals going from 40 years of age on up to 80 years of age. And then you're gonna play games with whether they're have no primary risk factors, whether they've got one, whether they've got two, whether they've got three, and you're going to see how the combinations of these risk factors cause an escalation in the risk of death from cardiovascular disease. The other thing that I want to point out is I want all of you to come away understanding the difference between men and women. And I'm somewhat joking about this, but I'm somewhat serious about it. We talk about equal rights. Ladies, you're gonna live on average at least 7 to 10 years longer than men. Well, that's a pretty amazing gift to have in life. And you'll see that in the graphs that you do when you plot the data for women and for men. You're gonna find out that for men, the incidence of coronary artery disease is much higher than it is for women. And no joke, 90% of all individuals, 90% of all individuals in our country today, hold on here for a sec, over the age of 90 are women. Sit there and think about that. My mother-in-law jokes about this. She says that where she lives, she's in a community for seniors. Is that what happens is that you've got this married couple, the husband dies, or excuse me, the husband dies. And so you've got all these women that come together, and so you've got this growing population of women, so that surviving men in there become prime targets, so to speak. And they start bringing them, dinners and stuff like that. And the sad thing, of course, is that they may have been the caretaker of their husband. Now they find another man and they become the caretaker for that guy, because eventually he ends up having the same problems that their husband has. So I'm joking about that, but there is some truth associated with it. Anyways, this is a phenomenal study. It's something that should strike all of you as being really important to being good health citizens. And the formula is pretty simple. Don't smoke. Don't have hypertension. That one's not quite so simple. And keep your cholesterol levels low. I have to say, I'm not a Robert Kennedy fan, but if you're following the news, he's a big health advocate. And the one thing I will say is that it's nice to actually have somebody who's high profile going into government who's going to really try to promote health. We've had individuals like this in the past, but we really need those types of individuals to keep the consciousness of our country and all of us, so that we eat properly, we stay healthy, we stay physically active, we do all the things to try to minimize the incidence of diabetes. That's what we really need in our lives. You guys will be some of those voices for the patients that you end up treating. Questions? Anybody got any questions, comments?
Yeah.
Yes, go for it.
What is the regular cholesterol level of 20 to?
What's the normal cholesterol level for folks in your age bracket? It's right around, I'll just say the 20-year-old, it's right around about 220 is an approximate value.
Okay. And then because you said for women, but for older, it's supposed to be 1? 10?
Don't think I said
Nope.
that.
No?
So
What was
we're
it
talking
again?
about blood pressure now.
Oh,
So,
blood pressure, okay.
Yeah, so blood pressure.
Oh, okay.
So what we'll do,
Hypertension.
and we'll be talking about this, is that any ladies in here have their blood pressure taken recently? Okay, don't say what it is. I'm just guessing, but the typical ballpark blood pressure for a woman in your age bracket is somewhere around a 110-ish over 70-ish. So would you be willing to share?
Yeah, mine was 126 over 84.
126 over 84,
And
okay?
in the clinical setting, we say 120 over 80
Okay.
is normal.
That's normal.
And then we have to repeat it if it's 130 over 90.
Good, okay. And Maria, what?
Mine is always like on the lower side, like 97 over 65.
97 or 65. If we took the average of you too, then we'd be where I'm talking about. So the standard textbook value, again, we'll talk about this, is 120 millimeters of mercury over 80 millimeters of mercury. That's the standard value. You heard her talking, saying that blood pressure 130 over 90 is where they start getting very interested. The clinical horizon
I'm
for
sorry, I
hypertension.
misspoke. It's 140. I missed.
Yes.
Sorry.
I was just gonna say, the clinical horizon for hypertension is 140 over 90. So if you go to your doctor and you're 128 over 86, no harm, no foul. But if you go to your doctor and you're 139 over 89 and you come back a second time, another occasion, and you're kind of that ballpark, your physician's gonna sit there and say, you know what, we need to start thinking about this because, as I said, the clinical horizon for hypertension is 140 over 90. Yeah.
For older patients, we usually, if they're already on like blood pressure medication, if they're like over 80, I say if it's typically like above 130, between 130, 140, the doctor prefers to leave it that way, like it's not considered high.
Yeah, so that's correct. So you're talking about folks who are maybe in their 50s, 60s, 70s?
Yeah, like 80s,
Yeah.
70s.
Yeah, if you can get somebody in the 130s,
Mhm.
that's what you're talking about, right? 130s, if I heard you right. You're not gonna do anything with them.
Yeah.
It's once you start bumping up into that 140 range and above. The other thing too is please realize there's what's called the white coat syndrome. The white coat syndrome is really in reference to a clinician, a doctor, PA, nurse practitioner, and you go into the office for physical or for whatever. Your sympathetic nervous system's gonna be elevated a little bit, and that controls blood pressure. So it's not unusual for people to come in there and say to their doctor, yeah, I just took my blood pressure the other day at home and I was 115 over 75, and they take it and you're like 135 over 85. And you're going, wow, that's 20 millimeters higher. But that's typically a white coat syndrome. Hypertension, hypertension, hypertension. That is a killer, as I will emphasize to you. It will destroy your heart. This is how people get into heart failure. And I think I told you about my mom. My mom was 83 years old, living life, just having a good old time. And one night she had a massive stroke. And that changed her life permanently to go from being completely independent to being completely dependent. And I think I told you, mercifully, she ended up dying a year later. It was terrible. Okay. So we're transitioning into the cardiovascular system. We really kind of began that last week in terms of talking about EKGs. I'm going to not focus on the anatomy of the heart. We'll talk about that as we continue, but I'm not going to focus on that right now. We're going to focus on what's called the cardiac cycle. And in doing that, I'm going to give you an overview of the cardiac cycle. And then we're going to talk about these two phases of the cardiac cycle. There's the rest phase. The rest phase is known as diastole. That's where the ventricles are relaxed and they're filling up with blood. Then there's the work phase. The work phase is systole. That's where we turn on the contractile machinery of the ventricles, and the ventricles contract and pump blood into the pulmonary circulation, that's what your right ventricle is doing. The left ventricle is responsible for pumping blood to every cell in your body. That left ventricle is the ultimate chamber of the heart because it's got to serve every cell in the body. So we're going to talk about that, then we'll get into the concept of stroke volume. From there, we're going to get into determinants of stroke volume. And you're going to learn that there are two main determinants. There's what's known as end diastolic volume. That's also associated with end systolic volume. And under each of these different volumes, you'll learn that there are several determinants. For instance, when we're talking about end diastolic volume, there's filling time, there's compliance, there's filling pressure. Under filling pressure, you can see we're concerned about blood volume, venous tone, the effect of gravity, muscle activity, blah, 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 so forth and so on. There's a lot of information in here, a lot of important information. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you an algorithm from problem solving. So I'll present to you various conditions of the heart, and you're going to have to use this model that I developed for you to use that as your guide for trying to solve what's going on or how you would treat a particular type of condition. And we're not going to get into this tonight, but we'll get into pressure volume diagrams. Pressure volume diagrams are simply plotting the relationship between blood pressure and the volume in the ventricles. And you'll learn a lot more about that. All right, so that's the game plan. We got a lot of information to cover. Between now and the end of the course. And this all revolves around the 5-step model. So here's kind of a naked version of our 5-step model, or a very brief description of the 5-step model. And we've talked a lot about ventilation, we've talked about gas exchange. You'll notice I don't have oxygen content up here. That's simply to provide room to talk about cardiac output. And here's our magical formula. Our magical formula for cardiac output is simply Q dot is equal to heart rate times stroke volume. So we're going to come along, and to be thinking about that formula, we really need to be thinking about what is known as a cardiac cycle. And there are two phases, the cardiac cycle. There's, as I already mentioned, there's a relaxation phase, and then there's a work phase. The relaxation phase is shown in blue. This is diastole. So let me just call a quick timeout. And here's where our focus is going to be. Our focus is purely on the left ventricle. Is everybody with me on that? We could talk about the filling and the pumping action of the left atrium, the right ventricle. But none of those three chambers has the responsibility of the left ventricle. As I already said, and I will keep saying ad nauseum, the left ventricle has to provide every cell in your body with adequate amounts of oxygen. Therefore, that's our focus, is on the left ventricle. But the concepts I'm describing here, you can apply to any of the other chambers of the heart. So, diastole. We're talking about diastole of the left ventricle, and during this phase, it's resting. It's in a relaxed state. And in this relaxed state, it's being filled with blood. So here we're going to talk about ventricular filling. So as we go through diastole, the ventricle fills up with more and more blood. Well, diastole then gives rise to systole. And this is the work phase. During diastole, we have ventricular filling. During systole, we have ventricular ejection. So we're pumping blood out into the circulatory system. So now you can see this is a logic diagram. This is not an anatomically correct diagram. This is a logic diagram. Over in the left side of the heart, we've got the left atrium on top, the left ventricle on the bottom. And now you can see I've got kind of this V-shaped structure pointing into the left ventricle. That is the left AV valve, the left atrioventricular valve. And that's what we're going to call it. So I'm just going to write here, left atrioventricular valve. You could simply refer to that as the left AV valve. And there's these little sayings that you can create to help you, these little mnemonics to help you remember what's what. And there's one that says try before you buy. Tricuspid before the bicuspid, meaning that the tricuspid valve is in the separating the right atrium from the right ventricle. We've got the bicuspid valve over there. It goes by a different name. What's the other name? Starts with an M. Mitral valve, right. But we're going to keep it simple and use terms that are actually descriptive as best as frequently as we can. So we're going to call this exactly what it is. It's the left AV valve. And that's a nice term. That left AV valve is regulating the flow of blood from the left atrium into the left ventricle. Now, as I will continue to stress, this is a logic diagram. And the logic is this. Here I'm showing the leaflets of the valve pointing into the left ventricle. As the left ventricle contracts and begins to push up on the leaflets, they're going to close. And they're going to prevent blood from flowing back into the left atrium and into the lungs. In reality, well, that's where we're at with that particular valve, okay? So make sure you understand the direction of the leaflets and the logic behind that directional description. So we've got blood during this phase flowing from the left atrium into the left ventricle. And therefore, all of you would tell me that during diastole, the left AV valve must be open or closed. It has to be open. That's the only way you can fill up the left ventricle. It's logic 101. And it sounds simple. It's not necessarily simple. But once you learn the logic, the beauty of it is there is logic you can apply here. There's reason you can apply here so that downstream you don't have to sit there and go, oh, I can't remember what happens. You just sit there and go, yeah, I understand the logic here. That valve is there, and its intention is to ensure that blood only flows in one direction. That's into the left ventricle. Well, Mr. Vargas, I've already given the answer away on this, but let's see how we can do. What are we going to call the volume in the ventricle at the end of diastole?
Filling volume?
What?
Filling volume?
That's a decent guess. Mr. Kent Wen, what would you call
Ventricular volume.
What?
And diastolic volume?
it? Aha, that's exactly right. That's what we will call it, is the end diastolic volume. Very good, Eric. Excellent. So here I'm just going to put E, D, V. Miss Camilla, what are you going to call the volume of the blood? By the way, this is in the ventricle. This is the volume of blood in the left ventricle. He's told us we're going to call it the end diastolic volume. What are we going to call the volume in the left ventricle at the end of systole?
ESV.
Say it again.
ESV.
We're going to call it the end systolic volume, or the ESV, right? The end systolic volume and the end diastolic volume. This is referred to as a cardiac cycle. Too bad Miss Chan's not here tonight. I was really looking forward to asking her questions. You guys might tell her if you haven't seen her. So that means I have to default to somebody else. Are you up to bat?
Sure.
I think you are. Give me a formula that will tell us how much blood is pumped out during a given cardiac cycle.
Heart rate times stroke volume.
No. Anybody, I need a formula that's going to describe for me how much blood was pumped out of the left ventricle during a given cardiac cycle. Did you volunteer?
Shouldn't it just be end-diastolic EDV minus ESV?
I like that. That's a good answer. He says very nonchalantly, he says very confidently, shouldn't it be end diastolic volume minus the end systolic volume? That's what he said, right?
Yes.
And that is the correct answer, by the way. That is our stroke volume. So, stroke volume, which is the volume of blood pumped out during a given cardiac cycle. So stroke volume is the volume of blood pumped out by the left ventricle during a single cardiac cycle. And so stroke volume is equal to end diastolic volume minus the end systolic volume. Mr. Lemmy, what do you think? Is that right?
Yes.
Yes, it is. That's exactly right. It is. So all I'm doing is just working from a granular view, and we're just kind of working down and kind of refining our picture, our story more and more. So we've got cardiac output is equal to heart rate times stroke volume. What determines stroke volume? The answer is it's the difference between end diastolic volume minus the end systolic volume. Now, Maria was sitting there and I was talking to her earlier, and she goes, yeah, I'm really curious about what determines the end diastolic volume. Right? So we're going to create a little algorithm, a little scheme to help problem solve. And it says the following. It says that cardiac output is equal to heart rate times stroke volume. And we're going to say that stroke volume is determined by both end diastolic volume and end systolic volume. So I'm going to put a little minus sign in here, and then over here to the far right I'm going to put end systolic volume. And as it turns out, there are three main factors that determine end diastolic volume. These three factors are filling time, stiffness, and filling pressure. All right, filling time. Mr. Cow, if the heart rate is low, filling time is going to be what? Short or long?
Heart rate is low, filling time is gonna be
If
low.
the cardiac output, if the heart rate, not cardiac output, if the heart rate is slow, then filling time, are we going through the cardiac cycle at a fast rate or a relatively slow rate?
Slow rate.
Okay, that's true. So the filling time is going to be what? Short or long?
Long.
Oh, is that right? Miss Elizabeth, what would you say?
I also thought it was long.
I think it's long too, you're right. Okay. So under filling time, I'm just gonna put heart rate. And you're gonna understand that what that means is really heart rate dictates the filling time. The faster the heart rate, the less time we have to fill up the ventricle with blood. That one's an easy one. Bless you.
Thank you.
Stiffness. We're going to plot force versus volume. Actually, I don't want to do that. We'll say force versus length. So imagine you've got a spring. I'm assuming all of you have played with springs one time or another in your life. And you know that springs can be very elastic. You don't need to exert much force to stretch a spring out. And other springs can be quite stiff. You really have to tug on the both ends to be able to stretch that spring out. So what we're talking about is the relationship between the force that's required to lengthen the spring. Now, this is kind of like the story of the alveoli and scleroderma. If you recall, what I mentioned there is that with scleroderma, you get this proliferation of connective tissue. It decreases the compliance. It increases the stiffness of the walls of the alveoli. And therefore, the alveoli cannot fill up with as much air. The same thing is true here, is that the walls of the heart can remodel themselves so that the ventricle becomes very stiff. And if the ventricle becomes very stiff, then we're not going to be able to fill it up with much blood at all. So stiffness is really important. So if we have something that is not stiff, then we get something like that, a curve that looks like that. Meaning that small changes in force produce large changes in length. Versus something that's stiff would mean that we have to exert a lot more force to get changes in the length. So here I'm going to write stiff, and here I'm going to write the word compliant. So I'm just showing those labels. I want to erase those, so hopefully everybody's got these guys written down. Mr. Curry, we've got a 65-year-old male has suffered from hypertension for the last 40 years of his life. His blood pressure has been chronically elevated, and this has led to remodeling of the walls of the left ventricle so that there's been this increase in connective tissue. The walls are much stiffer now. And so you're going to predict that due to this stiffness, what's going to happen to end diastolic volume? It will go up, right?
The volume will reduce. Not much volume.
Which volume? And systolic volume and diastolic volume.
In.
I'm just playing games with you guys tonight. I'm just trying to make life tough on you. Yeah, that's exactly right. He's got that exactly right. What's going to happen to cardiac output? Just look at that diagram up there. What's going to happen to stroke volume?
It would decrease.
It will decrease. What's going to happen to cardiac output?
It would also decrease.
It will decrease, that's exactly right. We've got an individual now who's in a type of heart failure. Talk to you more about that later on. But over years, the ability of the heart to provide adequate delivery of oxygen is going down. They're on this downward spiral through this type of heart failure eventually headed towards death as a result. Okay, under filling pressure. There are 4 critical factors under filling pressure. What are you smiling? Just smiling at me or what? We're going to say blood volume. I'm going to help you guys out with blood volume. Logic 101. What if the blood volume is 0? If the blood volume is 0, by definition, what will the filling pressure be? By the way, the filling pressure I'm talking about is the driving force is pushing blood into the left ventricle during diastole. That's our filling pressure. But Miss Maria, if there is no blood, by definition, the filling pressure must be, it must be 0. That's exactly right. And if you start off with that simple little piece of logic, now we sit there and you've got an individual who's a EMT, they get a call, they show up on the side of a freeway, they've got an individual who's been involved in a massive automobile accident. You get there, there's blood all over the freeway. This individual is bleeding out profusely. What's happening to their filling pressure?
It's lowering. It's lowering.
It's falling, right? And since it's falling, what's going to happen to the end diastolic volume?
It's gonna lower.
What's happening to stroke volume?
It's gonna lower.
What's happening to the ability to pump blood to the brain?
It's gonna lower.
Yeah. So when you show up in these types of accidents and you've got somebody who's bleeding, the first thing you have to do is what?
Say, oh,
First
no
thing.
bleeding. Stop the bleeding.
That's it. First thing is you got to stop the bleeding. Yeah, got to do that. So that's a simple way, I think, of thinking about blood volume. You just sit there and go to the worst case condition, which is somebody's completely bled out. Well, in that case, the filling pressure is 0 and diastolic volume 0. An interesting story, ties into our previous test number 3, but a sad story. You know, there's something sad in our society, I'm talking about worldwide, related to sports. And here's the thing that's sad. People try to win at all costs. They cheat. Cheat. Do any of you know who Lance Armstrong is? Who is he?
The biker.
Lance Armstrong was probably the greatest cyclist of all time. The Tour de France, if you've never watched the Tour de France, I challenge each and every one of you to do that. It is the greatest endurance event, period. These guys are the greatest endurance athletes on planet Earth. He won the Tour de France 7 times and swore he never cheated until his teammates ratted him out. And here's the sad thing is Lance Armstrong was a cancer survivor, he recovered, and then he became this incredibly successful Tour de France athlete. And you want to root for people like this, and then you find out it wasn't el natural. Well, somewhere along those lines, the Swedish cyclist team back in 1982-ish or so, there was this hormone that was discovered that regulates the formation of red blood cells. What's the name of that hormone?
I don't know.
Don't know.
Erythropoiesis.
Erythropoietin, and there's this company up in Thousand Oaks, right, probably 60, 70 miles north of us here, called Amgen, one of the greatest biotech companies ever. And what they did through genetic engineering was they learned how to transfect E. coli to produce erythropoietin. So now they had this amazing way of generating tons of erythropoietin. Before that, they had to go out and slaughter tons of cows to get adequate amounts of erythropoietin. Well, these Swedish cyclists, they figured, hey, we know something. We know that this hormone is going to stimulate our red blood cells to produce more, stimulate our bone marrow to produce more red blood cells. And we'll have more hemoglobin. And our oxygen content in the blood will go up. And we'll be able to deliver more oxygen to our working muscles. And they'll be able to work at higher levels. And we'll be more successful. Only one problem is that by producing all those red blood cells, they change the viscosity of their blood. What is viscosity measure of? Mr. Corey, what is viscosity measure of?
Viscosity is the measure of the flow or density of the liquid as it flows.
I'm thinking of a word that starts with a T, ends with an S. What are you thinking of?
Thickness.
That's what I'm thinking of. That's exactly that word, thickness. All of you know that the fluids that we deal with, some of them have very low viscosity. That means that there's very little resistance to moving them through a tube or some type of a device. Whereas things that are very viscous are hard to move. So they changed the viscosity of their blood. They made it thicker. And all of a sudden the work that their hearts had to do went way up. And guess what happened? 5 of them end up dying as a result of this because they put themselves into kind of a heart failure. Anyways, blood volume. All right, here's another factor, and this is called venous tone. So with venous tone, what we're talking about is the smooth muscle cells that make up the veins. Before I go down that road, let me try to make a couple of points. This side, if everybody will look up here for a moment. So I'm talking about here. We're talking about from the aorta into the arteries into the arterial tree. These are the resistance vessels. So over here I'm going to write resistance vessels. What, do you want to answer my question? There is a formula that you know that talks about the relationship between flow rate, resistance, and pressure. What is it? Ohm's law. Okay, write that for me with regards to pressure.
Pressure times resistance equals flow rate, or flow rate equals delta P over R.
Yeah, I need you to solve for pressure though. Pressure equals
Force over area.
flow,
I'm sorry.
flow rate.
Okay. Flow rate divided by resistance.
Flow rate times resistance.
Very good. Flow rate times resistance. Folks, just time out. If the smooth muscle cells on the arterial side, on this resistance side, are contracting, then the lumen of the blood vessels is larger or smaller. The radius of the lumen is what? Larger or smaller? Smaller. That creates more resistance, which causes blood pressure to go up. That's that side of the equation. Over on this side of our algorithm or our logic diagram, the veins serve not as resistance vessels, but as capacitance vessels. And when you see that word capacitance, what that means is that they have the ability to dilate quite a bit. And all of you should recognize that, because if you're like I am and you go to the gym and you work out, you sit there and start looking at the veins on the back of your hand or your arms, and after you've been working out for quite a while, they have dilated significantly. So our veins have the ability to dilate much more than the vessels on the resistance side of our equation. So their ability to hold, their capacity to hold blood is quite a bit different. So imagine that we have a vein and it dilates. What's happened to the amount of blood that's in the veins now? Is it the same as it was before? Is it less or is it more? It's more. And this dilation of the veins is somewhat analogous to taking blood out of the circulatory system, because now the volume of blood that's being held in the veins is much greater. So as I said, it's somewhat analogous to decreasing blood volume. So if we come along and our veins dilate, then the amount of blood held within the veins goes up, and you're going to tell me that filling pressure is going to also go up, right? Mr. Wynn? He's shaking his head saying yes. You're shaking your head saying no. Which of you two is right?
I don't think it goes up. I think it goes down.
I think filling pressure is going to go down, right? So, venous tone. When we talk about venous tone, we're talking about the contractile state of the smooth muscles in the veins. So when the venous tone is high, then you're going to understand that there will be less blood in the veins, and therefore filling pressure will go up. If filling pressure goes up, we're going to predict that EDV will go up. And if EDV goes up, we're going to predict that stroke volume will go up. And if stroke volume goes up, we're going to predict that cardiac output is going to go up. Maria, if cardiac output goes up, what happens to the oxygen delivery rate to the cells of the body?
Increases.
It increases, right? That's exactly right. So it's not that we're just only concerned about cardiac output and that's it. We're concerned about cardiac output because that determines oxygen delivery to the cells of our body. The story is all about oxygen. If venous tone goes down, then the veins dilate, they hold more blood. That causes the filling pressure to go down. That causes the end diastolic volume to go down. That causes stroke volume to go down, causing cardiac output to go down. All right. Any questions so far? Muscle activity. Here I'm talking about skeletal muscle activity. Andrew, what do you think? Does increased muscle activity cause filling pressure to go up or cause it to go down? What do you think?
I would say,
And why would you say that?
when there's a lot of muscle activity, we need more oxygen, so then they would want to get more blood flow.
Okay, all right. Anybody else have an answer?
Because you need more ATP.
Okay, all right. Anybody else? The answer is right here. Mr. Cal, what can you tell us about the structure of veins? Something that's different about veins versus arteries.
They have,
You hadn't had me last semester, right?
yes, along with my colleagues.
Your colleague, should I ask your colleague?
I think I can try.
Okay, take a shot at it.
They have a thinner tunica media,
Uh-huh.
and they have valves,
Oh, valves.
one-way valves.
One-way valves. Well, that's kind of cool if you sit there and think about that. That those one-way valves make sure that the blood only flows one way, right? That's pretty cool if you sit there and think about that. So here's one of these one-way valves. And Mr. Cal, tell us about the circulatory anatomy of muscles. They have arteries, right? There's arteries in muscles, right?
Yes, yes,
There's also capillaries, right?
that's correct.
And there's also veins, right?
Yes.
And when those muscles contract, what do they do to those veins?
I'm not sure.
Yes.
Isn't it ventricular sicily? So then when you contract your muscles, it'll slowly push the blood up and it'll open the valve.
No.
No?
No.
Okay.
What do you guys think? If a muscle contracts, what happens to the flow of blood through veins?
It squeezes it?
I'm gonna say it might stop because it crushes, not crushes like destroys, but it's,
It compresses, right? It compresses those veins.
yes.
So sit there and think about this, is that I have a muscle, it contracts, it compresses the vein, relaxes, compresses the vein, relaxes, compresses the veins, relax, compresses the veins, relax. That's our muscle turning on and off. It's compressing and then the muscle relaxes, the vein relaxes. And we do this over and over. And how's that going to affect our filling pressure?
That is going to,
It's going to cause blood to flow in one direction, right?
yes,
Away from the heart or back to the heart?
back to the heart,
What's it going to do to filling pressure?
increase.
That's exactly right. It's going to increase. So during physical activity, your skeletal muscles actually act as assist pumps. They're assisting the ventricle, the left ventricle, in terms of pumping blood by ensuring that the left ventricle has a huge filling pressure to help it fill up with blood. That's pretty cool biology. So here I'm just going to show the presence of muscles, and all of you will realize that when the muscle contracts, it's going to compress the vein. I'm just showing that by this dashed or dotted blue line. And since there's these valves, that ensures that the blood is only flowing back towards the heart, ensuring that our filling pressure will go up. That's cool. Once you see it, hopefully it makes perfect sense to you. It's not something where you're scratching your head going, I don't get it. Muscle activity. So, as part of our problem-solving model, as muscle activity goes up, filling pressure goes up. That causes EDV to go up, stroke volume to go up, and cardiac output to go up. We're going to come back to this when the this last part of this diagram. The last one has to do with yesterday. Not the song yesterday. The song yesterday, that was written by, who was that written by? Oh yeah, Taylor Swift. No, come on, what are you shaking your head no? Taylor Swift's written every good song known to mankind.
Paul McCartney.
Whoa, Paul McCartney. Holy mollies. I don't want to play song trivia with you. Good job on that. The Beatles, right? Paul McCartney. Number 4. What happened yesterday? Mr. Curry, what happened yesterday? It was one of the most exciting events in your lifetimes that's happened yesterday.
We took an exam.
No, that's not very exciting. No.
Oh, that was Monday. Sorry, my week is all over.
Has to do with our favorite billionaire, Elon Musk. They shot off Starship 6. Amazing stuff, really amazing. And when we think about space, we sometimes think about what? Very good, gravity. So here we're going to put the effect of gravity. Not that we're changing gravity, but we're changing the effect of gravity. All right, so I'm going to put a single chamber up here. That's going to represent the left ventricle. All right. So what we're going to do is we're going to change our heart into a cylinder of your car. And so in the cylinders of your car, you've got the cylinder itself. This part represents the cylinder in your engine. Typically, most of you in here are probably driving 6-cylinder engines. Maybe some of you are driving V8s, 8-cylinder engines. And in those cylinders are pistons that move up and down. What the piston does is air is injected into the cylinder. The piston comes up to compress the air, you ignite it, and it causes a controlled explosion, causing your piston to drive down, and this goes on over and over and over. Here, for us, we're going to say that the movement of this piston up and down is going to determine the flow of blood out of the left ventricle. So in this story, this represents our left ventricle. We've got the valve that regulates the flow of blood from the left ventricle into the aorta, and this is the aortic valve. And then we've got this driving force that brings blood back to the left ventricle to fill it up over cycle after cycle. In here, I'm gonna put filling pressure. Let's see here. Kathy Lay. Good evening, Kathy. Can you give me a formula for work, mechanical work? If you don't know, you can pass over there to Mr. You can pass? Just tell me what you gonna say. Formula for work.
Not too sure.
No? Go for it. Anna.
I think it's
No, I think, come on.
force times length.
Force times a change in distance or change in length, that would be work, right? So here, our formula would be that work equals force times, we'll say, distance. And in this scenario, where's the lowest point in that diagram? Jocelyn, where's the lowest point in that diagram? Don't be too quantitative about it, be qualitative about it. Is the lowest point in this diagram, is it there? How about there? How about here? How about there? What was that? It was a yes? Yes, it was a yes. That's exactly right. So here's the lowest point. You could say, oh, there's the lowest point, but there's the lowest point. Mr. Vargas, where's the lowest point in your body right now?
Pressure wise?
Huh?
Pressure wise?
No, lowest point anatomically, where is it?
Oh, my feet.
Yeah, where's it for me? It's in my feet. That's here, right there. Now, my left ventricle is the pump. It's responsible for pushing the blood throughout this circuit. And to do this, it has to do work. The work that we're focused on is lifting the blood from here on up to here. That's our distance. The shorter that distance, the more work the heart has to do, or the less work it has to do. Less work, that's right. So my heart is producing a certain amount of work on every contraction. And here's what I do. I lie down. And now, when I lie down, where's the lowest point for my body? It's right here on this surface right here. And so right now, my heart is working against a fluid column that's about this high. From my legs to here, that's the fluid column that my heart's having to work against. If I lie down, that fluid column is that high. In which case is my heart having to do the most work? Standing or lying? Standing, right? My heart's having to do a lot of work. So listen to me. The heart can produce a certain amount of energy. If I'm using most of that energy just to lift the blood back up to the heart, how much energy is left over to push the blood into the left ventricle? A lot or a little bit? Here's the hypothetical again. If I'm using most of the energy that my heart's producing just to lift the blood back up to the level of the heart, does that mean there's a lot of energy or a lot of work left over that we can use as a filling pressure to fill up the left ventricle? What's your answer?
No.
No. As soon as I lie down, all of a sudden the work that the heart has to do to return blood back goes way down, right? Because now we're working against a fluid column like that. And what happens to the filling pressure? Is the filling pressure going to stay the same? Is it going to go up or is it going to go down? And the answer is, it's going to go way up. And so when you lie down, all of a sudden, what happens to filling pressure? It goes up. What happens to end-diastolic volume? It goes up. What happens to stroke volume? It goes up. What happens to cardiac output? It goes up. So here you are, all of you, because of my inspirational speech to you about Elon Musk, you go to sign up to become a SpaceX astronaut. And you're at T minus 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and all of a sudden, off you go. And you're into space. How much gravity is there in space? We'll say it's 0. So, what's happened? I'm standing up, I'm in space. What's happened to the amount of work that my heart's having to do to lift blood back up to the level of the heart? Is it the amount of work gone way up? Has it gone way down? Come on, what do you guys think? Way up? Elizabeth, way up? Go with me, come on, way up, right? Andrew? Did you say way down?
Yes.
I think so, way down. Exactly right. So, the effect of gravity. You go into space, the effect of gravity goes way down. The filling pressure goes way up. Because now the heart is not having to overcome the effect of gravity. End-diastolic volume goes way up. Stroke volume goes way up. Cardiac output goes way up. Only one problem is that now you sit there and go, Elon, I think I've got to go to the bathroom. Because what you're going to find out is that when cardiac output goes up, you're going to start producing urine at a higher rate. What do you guys think? Is it pretty easy to urinate in space? Just take a whiz and no problem? No? Is it more difficult than that? What do you need?
Gravity.
Well, I don't have gravity in space, so how am I going to go to the bathroom? Let me give you a term. Let's see if it resonates with you guys. You're going to hook up, but I'm not talking about that type of hooking up. Going to hook up to what?
Vacuum.
A vacuum. That's exactly right. Do you think that's just like going across the hallway there and that's an event. That's a half-hour event right there. Yeah, you don't want any droplets of urine floating around in your space capsule. And by the way, in the space shuttle back many years ago, they had some monkeys up there, some minkies, and they were in a basically contained environment where they lost their containment. The monkeys stayed in where they were at, but all their urine and feces went flying through the ship. That's a problem. They don't have this show. I know there's this old thing, you guys don't watch this anymore, called TV. I know all you guys are YouTubers or... It's called America's Funniest Videos. Any of you ever watched that? Come on, none of you are old enough to have seen that. And invariably, they'd have these videos of this couple getting married. And you'd see either the bride or the groom starting to do this. And the next thing you know, down they would go. As they're standing there, think about this. Gravity wants all the blood in the feet. And they're sitting there, they're standing there, their heart's trying to do all this work to get the blood back up, but their muscles aren't active. They're not acting as assist pumps to help get blood back to the heart. And so they gray out, their visual field collapses on them. All of you should be sensitive to your visual field, collapses on them, and then they're out. And guess what? They fall down, and what happened to the effect of gravity?
It's down.
It goes way down, right? And then all of a sudden, what happens to the filling pressure? It goes way up. And what happens to end-diastolic volume? Way up. Stroke volume, way up. Blood flow to the brain, way up. And they wake up and go, what happened? They go, oh, you said you did, or you do. So you see in the Army, anybody ever been in the military in here? You have these folks who are at attention. Here's what they do, is that as they're staying at attention, they're tightening their gluteal muscles, or they're tightening their calf muscles off and on as a way so that they prevent passing out as they're standing there for long periods of time at attention. The effect of muscle, the effect of gravity right there. Okay, we're done in here for tonight. I'll see you guys upstairs in about 15